Clean Start deals mostly with early stage companies. And you're like the prime example of one that struggled through all that early stuff, made it to becoming public, hopefully some exits in there for some of you that struggled so long. But I wanted to talk about the early days because they're some of the hardest ones for people to deal with. And we just had a talk with a lady who's been through this. She put it this way. She said, in the early stages, entrepreneurs go through the trough of sorrow after you've hit the high of enthusiasm of coming up with an idea and seeing that people are interested in it. When you get into the really hard work and you realize what's ahead of you and that you don't have much money. So you were probably, according to her definition, in the trough of sorrow in the early 2000s. What was the first money you were able to bring in? Was it friends and family, grants?
The very first money that we brought in was grants. So that was was the motivating force for us to get together and do something. And we won something called the People, Prosperity, and the Planet Award from the EPA, the US EPA. A lot of the SBIR and programs and things like that, they try to make a cohort out of the winners and drive some sort of community around it. And they try to teach you how to do things. It was sort of the same thing for the P3 grant. They sort of tried to build a bit of a community around it. So I actually know some of the other companies that won a P3 grant around the same time we did. And some have done, really, really interesting things and are still around. And so that was really what got us going. And that was the first money in. But to your point, there wasn't much to it. It was, my memory is that it was $85,000 in total, which doesn't really get you very far in the world of hard technology. There wasn't any lab space in Sacramento that you could just walk in and rent back then,
right?
2008. And so you had to build out all of your own lab space, which is not trivial. We spent real money, especially when you're considering that real money to us was $85,000. We spent all of that and more actually just getting facilities that we could use to do the research we wanted to do. It was quite challenging. Now I think there are some much better options in the area to sort of just get rolling for hard technology industry. There are labs available that you can use. We've actually given this years ago, we gave people access to one of our benches and they basically just paid rent, not because we wanted to turn it into a business, but because we were just trying to be helpful to the community.
I appreciate that you did that before. I wasn't aware that you had done that, but now we have Tim Keller's space. You've got the John Sullivan Ag Start space. I'm
Yes.
sure there are others.
Right. And I think it makes all the difference. It means that you're not spending all of your time and money and energy in the beginning, just building a place to work,
Yeah, well, and that's so important. It's wonderful what John has done because things like autoclaves and big freezers and clean room and stuff like that, nobody can afford to pay that on their own. But if it's a shared facility, it works. So
yeah, that's right.
I've been impressed with what happens there. Now in clean tech, the interesting thing is, unless you're really in a hard tech area like you were, people like to work out of their garages, work out of home. We've never seen much of an interest in having, maker space or lab space or anything like that. But there is some of it around. So what was it like? Were you first in space in Davis, or did you go to the cheap space in West Sacramento?
No, we were looking around and we thought we might be able to find something in Davis and ended up in West Sac because as soon as we realized that really we were just looking for cheap, empty space, going to find lab space anywhere that was already built out. We just had to go as cheap as possible. So within reason. So we found at the time, I think, I don't remember exactly, but I think we might have paid 41 cents a square foot for that space out there because it was, the middle of it was really cheap. It was great. And it was the middle of the recession too, right? Or the bust was was happening. And so, yeah, it was really good. But we had to think, I think that we, after our Series A, we sort of got to do the rest of the build out. And I think by the time we were done, we probably put $200,000 into building out lab space. And it wasn't premium lab space. If you look at it, it was, we did everything on the cheap. We got hoods and benches that were used. We installed a bunch of it ourselves. And, it was pretty cheap.
So the good old days.
Yeah, right. That's right.
So $200,000, you got an $85,000 grant. Where'd the rest of it come from? Is that a friends and family thing?
It was, yeah. So we had, friends, family, and then some local business owners. It turned out that what we were doing was, it wasn't exactly similar to anything anybody else was doing, but there were a couple industries of people who sort of understood, they got it. They got what we were
Right.
trying to do. Now, back then, we were doing fermentation of wastewater into biodegradable plastic. And
Uh-huh.
so, the folks that we were talking to came out of the wastewater industry. So they understood wastewater, they understood heavy construction, those kinds of things. And so that was really the first chunk of money. And then friends and family too. And so when we put all that together, that was sort of enough to get a little bit more space, get a few folks to do some work on it. We were doing some pilot testing at that point too. And so, we really needed people to help us run this thing.
Right.
And so those were, first couple of hires, equipment, that was sort of how that got spent.
So the first hires, from the way you're describing it, they were going to be more technical engineering types. Your
Yeah,
first hires
engineers.
were salespeople because you first had to prove that everything worked.
Yeah, what we understand now is that we were in the business of developing new, what we would consider platform process technology. And now when we were working on the fermentation technology, which was only about 18 months or something like that, or a year, we sort of weren't that sophisticated around it. And not to say that we're ultra sophisticated about everything now, but we didn't really understand how big of a thing we were getting into. We did understand it better when we took on the chemical process technology, but that's a long arc. It's technology development like this is 10 to 15 years. There's sort of no way around it. And the industry doesn't really do it anymore for partly for that reason, but also for some sort of structural reasons. And so one, that's the opportunity for us, but two, it means that there wasn't really, we had to educate everybody on how we were doing this and why for all the way through our staff, our investors, our customers, right? And so our sales process, getting back to your comment about salespeople, our sales process doesn't really look like most sales processes. It's a long-term partnership with our customers. They have to go a long time before they even receive first product. It's so our engineers were actually very involved in a lot of that process too.
So that was as you're describing it, that was building a partnership with somebody that you had hoped eventually became a customer.
Right,
So
exactly.
what were they giving you in money along the way? Was it development money in exchange for some kind of rights to the product?
That's right. We actually, although to be fair, we really didn't get much capital from partners. I think part of it was that we were basically a bunch of kids and we didn't know the right shibboleths to say, right? To get capital out of these companies. We didn't really understand how to even navigate their sort of budget processes and PO and approval. I mean, we didn't know what the hell we were doing. And so we're building these relationships. We actually built really good relationships with a lot of them, but we didn't know how to ask for any resources. We sort of kept waiting for them to offer. And some of them kind of did.
Please invite me to the prom.
Yeah, this is the first few years. And some of them kind of did, honestly. Ultimately, once we rolled around and we sort of got ourselves organized by 15, 16, 17, we had Danone and Nestle and Pepsi were major equity participants. We ended up with off takes where they prepaid a bunch of we sort of got our ducks in a row at that point, but it took us a little while.
So, in this whole process, you said, you were kids and you didn't know how to go about this. Looking back on it, how should you have approached partners and potential customers?
I think we would have, we get the benefit of actually kind of doing that all the time, because restarting this kind of stuff all the time, because we in platform technology development, you're often trying to get into a new application area and talk to a totally new customer value chain, say, hey, I think that my product that I've been making off of my same technology I've been doing for the last 10 years, but this product, I don't think you guys have ever seen it. You should take a look at how you think it, how it could impact your business. And when we do that, we're sort of building a whole new ecosystem of customers, right? It's the same product, but we're going to them and saying, we think you could use it for surfactants instead of polymers, right? Something like that. And so we get to start that whole process all over again. And I think the most important thing is to be really thoughtful about how much proof do you need? How much knowledge do you need internally? And before you go to a customer, what's the absolute minimum? You have to have this much. And then go to the customers or partners as soon as possible and be as transparent with them as you can be about what you think the value proposition is and what you're doing and why you're trying to do it and all those kinds of things. Because you need to validate that value proposition with them as soon as possible. And you pretty much never get it exactly right off the bat. You're always going to learn stuff from them. But that's building a relationship, right? You're bringing them something, you have uncertainty, they talk to you about it, they tell you what they need. You sort of go back and forth, you adjust this thing. And I think the earlier you can do that, the better. And I think what does actually, we sort of got it right that a lot of that stuff does naturally emerge. You've got to ask for it, but at a certain point you sort of say, okay, well, this is what we're trying to do. This is why you want it. What are the resources we've got on the table to make it happen? Because if it's sufficiently valuable for them, they're going to care about making it happen. And you figure out how do you put your heads together and get the resources. And sometimes that means that they've got the cash, right? Or they've got something else. And if they put that down, then it happens. And if they don't, maybe it doesn't. So I think that is sort of, naturally the right way to do it. I don't think that some people believe that the right answer is to kind of play hardball on this sort of thing. I don't think that's right. I know people have success doing that sometimes, but I think that's almost by accident. It's much less robust.
I mean, you pretty much kept control of the technology. You had patents on it.
Yep.
And there comes a time when you think about, well, maybe we should just license the technology to somebody else. But if you're
Yep.
developing a new platform process, there's a natural tendency to say, no, not until we know exactly what we have here. We don't want somebody to go out and try to use it, make some mistakes, and then blame us. So what was that thought process like?
I mean, it was almost exactly what you just described. It was, you don't want to give people, I mean, part of the way to think about that is platform technologies inherently have lots of decisions, right, involved in them. The way you use it, the way you configure it, the way you scale it. And obviously we've spent, a long time thinking about and studying just this platform technology. So if we're honest with ourselves, we're pretty much the only, we're best positioned and pretty much the only people that are positioned to figure out what to do with it, how to make it go. So early on, that was an overriding feature, right? All of our decision making. And I think it was right. I don't think there was somebody who was going to come in and say, oh yeah, well, we could have done it way better if you just partnered with us to let us make all the decisions around it. Once you get to a certain level of development, then it makes a lot of sense to work with partners and licensing or whatever else. Our view tends to be not a straight license, but sort of contribution of technology into a joint project where that contribution of technology and maybe other resources gets us ownership rather than gets us a license fee, something like that. My sort of view on that is when you create a lot of value in an industry that margins matter, the sort of sneaky but also the most straightforward, honestly, somewhat paradoxically, the way to retain and access that value is by actually owning the assets that your technology built, right? Or that represent your technology. And so our view is that that's by far the most important way to do this. It doesn't mean we won't license, we will, but that's the goal isn't to go license. The goal is to get assets built where we get to have an ownership stake in them. Doesn't mean we have to have an even dominant ownership stake, but we want to own parts of it. If it's a good plant, we want to own part of that plant,
Well, yeah, if you can hang on to it, that's
Right.
obviously where you harvest a lot of value. So another thing that's unique in your story is you had like this unique friendship, the three of you founding the company, and that's been very stable over time. And what was that like? I mean, co-CEOs are not common, and
Yep.
sometimes they fall apart pretty fast. Yours has been incredibly stable. So what
Ah,
was that decision like?
well, so there are, let me sort of disambiguate that a little bit. So the three co-founders, Casey McGrath, Ryan Smith, and me, and there were actually some earlier sort of co-founders too who didn't really commit to the project in the same way. And so, you have to kind of like decide where you're going to cut on this thing in terms of where's the start point. So I think it's reasonable to say that there were just three of us, but I think technically there were actually more than that in the first 3 months or something like that. But the three co-founders, Casey McGrath, Ryan Smith, and myself, were, I think we just always respected each other and treat each other like adults to the extent that we could. Yeah, I think that's like, I have a friend who considers relationships where one adult is treating the other person like an adult. That's sort of like an aspirational goal that may never be achieved by any two human beings, right? But it's what you want to do. And I think we do a pretty good job of that. The three of us are very different people in a lot of ways and have very different skill sets. And so I think we just, we tried to be reasonable about those sorts of things. Everybody was making sacrifices to do this, and it doesn't mean that everybody always gets what they want. You have to have hard conversations. And sometimes that means that, not everybody's going to get the thing that they were asking for or that they would like. But you try to be respectful of the time and the effort that they put in. And so as a consequence, when we made some of our strategic technology changes, Casey McGrath, one of those three founders, actually didn't end up staying with the company very much longer. He stayed on the board for a while, but his skill was microbiology. When we're a hardcore sort of catalytic chemistry company, like it doesn't make that much sense. And so ultimately he ended up, he went to grad school at Stanford and went and did other things. We have stayed reasonably in touch, although I don't talk to him that much anymore. But we always had a good relationship there. And then, Ryan and I have been working closely together the whole time. He's an integral part of the company. Very customer focused, has been customer and application focused. It's turned out to be one of his real skill sets, which is nice. And then you mentioned the co-CEO relationship. That's actually, so Rich Riley is my co-CEO. He was an investor really early on. So he was an investor in our Series A. And so I've known him for years, but he didn't actually join the company until just a little bit before we took the company public. And so the co-CEO relationship is something that developed much later. But I think, I try to bring the same, and I think Rich tries to bring the same approach, which is, recognition that we're all working towards the same goal, respect, patience, empathy, good communication. And I think with the co-CEO and the founder roles too, or relationships, trust is just huge. And trust isn't something that is given, it's something that's earned, right? So just really being aware of when they're the first person that you have to have a particular kind of conversation with, it just makes all the difference. And so I think it's been a good one, but and it hasn't been very hard in the sense that we had to fight through to get to something good, but I think it requires a lot of mindfulness all the time for both the co-founder relationships and the co-CEO relationships.
So the decision-making process, as you're describing it, is pretty much have a rule. You need to be unanimous in the decisions that are made, and you have to talk them through until you get that consensus. Is it close
That's
to
pretty much right.
correct?
I think, again, sometimes that's aspirational, right? There are decisions where maybe he and I don't exactly agree on it, if it's a small to medium-sized thing. But we also understand when, who sort of owns that decision. And so if it's something big enough that it's sort of strategic for the whole company, then we're going to, we'll figure it out. We're not going to just let it go and sort of let the pitch go by. But, he and I aren't exactly in sync on every single thought all the way through, but even though we're pretty close. And so I think it's decision rights matter a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are areas where I have the decision rights because that's my area of expertise. And it's also, my reporting chain. We sort of divide up the reporting chains, and there are areas where it's his. And then unless it's a strategic issue, as I said, if it's his, it's his, right? And I'm obviously, we're going to talk about it in a really productive and useful way, but ultimately it's going to be his decision to drive it. I think the key is I have trust that he is really going to, and I think likewise, consider all of my feedback in a really genuine and holistic way on the topic.
Mm-hmm.
And so if he ends up not, or I'll do it the other way. If I end up not doing or taking his immediate suggestion, which is relatively uncommon, it isn't cursory, right? I really thought about it, and I have a lot of reasons why I think this is the right answer and appreciate the feedback, but there's still got to be a decision that has to be made, right? And I think he does the exact same thing, and I trust that he does the same thing. So I think those are key.
So recently you brought a CFO into the mix.
Yeah.
So what was that process like, and how were you handling the financial matters before you had an official CFO?
Well, we had a CFO starting I guess it was about a year before we took the company public. And we hired that CFO. And by the way, actually, it's an interesting question because there was a long time where we didn't have a CFO, right? I mean, most of the company's history as a private company, we didn't have a CFO at all. And I think that was a mistake in retrospect. CFOs are expensive. We were a relatively simple business from an operating perspective. We were a research and capital development business, basically, right? It's pretty straightforward. We spend money. And so it didn't feel like having a CFO was necessary from that perspective. But, obviously, there are other components of a CFO's job that aren't just financial operations. And we missed a lot of that. I would fill in. We have a wonderful sort of extremely high level FP&A person who would fill in on a lot of those things. but that's not the same as having a CFO. And so I wish we had hired a CFO much earlier. That was a mistake in retrospect. But in any case, we got one about a year before we took the company public. And at that time, we were anticipating we'd stay private. And so that has a particular, skill set that you're looking for a CFO. You're expecting to stay a private company. Ultimately, relatively soon after hiring, we decided to take the company public. And I'm like, all right, well, I guess we're all doing it together. And so, but with the knowledge again that his skill set and was really a private company skill set. And so ultimately we ended up relatively recently, to your point, changing CFOs to somebody who has a skill set that's more directly targeted at the kind of company that we are right now. And honestly, it's been wonderful. Really, Matt, our new CFO, is a real partner in the management team. Again, I think he has in this case, the operational element is really nice. He has a great sense of operational capability. He really can pick up some of the leadership mantle, which is always nice. I sort of forget. I've had it for so long that I forget what it's like or how heavy it can be. But when somebody else comes in and sort of lifts a little bit of it, you're like, oh man, I forgot. It's nice to have a little bit more space. So that's been wonderful. Integrating in with the culture really well. Has started to interact with our investors a lot more, which is something that Rich and I were doing. We were sort of sharing that investor relations role. And so I think it's been great. And I think one of the things we should, not right off the bat, but we should have hired a CFO earlier. One of the things that I think we got right was hiring a general counsel relatively early. We actually hired a general counsel before we hired a CFO, partly because we found a great general counsel. And so it felt like, boy, I don't want to let this pitch go by. But that was something I also advocate for is I think people should not Series A or something like that, right? But people should hire general counsels and CFOs both earlier than sometimes people want to.
Well, that's an important insight. And you characterize the difference between a private company CFO and a public company one. What would you say is the difference? I mean, I understand that if you're a public company CFO, it's a lot of SEC reporting and answering their questions and dealing with thousands of investors that can be very needy. Is it that, or is it something more that distinguishes between private company and public company CFO?
So it's that. It's also, financing mechanisms are different, operating standards are different. So, which may not be put into, regulatory requirements or something like that. There are those too, but just the expectation, it's sort of like taking an R&D engineer and sticking him in a manufacturing environment. This is a sort of bit of a ham-fisted analogy, but I think it gets the point across. They're both engineers. They might even both be chemical engineers, right? But and they might even be able to do exactly the same job, right? From a skill set perspective. But the operating style in an R&D environment is really different than the operating style in a manufacturing environment. And people can be temperamentally suited to one versus the other, in addition to all of the unspoken and differences in behavior and expectations. And so I think that's a big part of it. I think there's another element, which is the kinds of companies that end up being like the industries and sort of operating strategies of companies in the private and the public space they're less differentiated now than they were, say, 15 years ago, right? But the kinds of companies in each space are somewhat characteristically different. Again, not because they have to be, it's just the way it's worked out. And so I think that also, some skill, and now I'm speaking not so much just relevant to origin, because obviously we were the same kind of company, just crossing one to the other. But answering more your general question of public versus private company CFO, I think, if you've got a CFO from let's say private companies, and they've had 3 or 4 experiences, the sort of those experiences is going to be pretty different, I think, than the typical public company CFO that's had 3 or 4 different experiences. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I understand that. And you bring it up in the context of R&D engineer versus manufacturing engineer, which is also an important distinction. So, what's your story in sort of bringing manufacturing and process engineers on board to make your whole production real and efficient and well designed?
Yeah, well, I think that's a journey that we're on. I think we bias really heavily towards people getting to see the sort of entire life cycle of both projects and technology. I think we're lucky we can do that in part because we have people who have been at Origin for a long time, since quite a few people since the beginning. And so they get to see all of that project and technology history, and then they can bring that to bear when they do something like, they move from R&D to process design to, not as the principal person for every single one of those often, because they need to work with the EPC, and another process design engineer who's maybe expert just in that, but they can sort of carry all of that history with them. And so we bias quite heavily towards that. We think that's really important to have all of the historical knowledge of the technology and the project and why decisions were made, all those kinds of things. So we've seen, R&D engineers that crossed into manufacturing engineers. We've got a couple of them, and it's wonderful. They can do a job that nobody else could do because they know so much about how that works. On the flip side, I mean, we were talking about sort of temperament and how that applies to private versus public companies. The same thing's true for these different environments. And so even if they bring a lot of value and want to understand how to engage in these environments, you still have to, you've got to bring people who do just that, who have experience just in manufacturing support, for example. So we've been doing that. We have both. I think we started with mostly athletes. That's what we call somebody who sort of they can kind of do all the things if you need them to. We started with mostly athletes doing the engineering support for our manufacturing facility. And relatively recently, we brought on dedicated sort of experienced manufacturing people. And that knowledge transfer has been wonderful in both directions. But I suspect that we will be on a multi-year journey of getting good at manufacturing. Manufacturing is really hard, especially with new technology.
So your employees base right now, I mean, obviously you've got things going on in Canada and starting out in Louisiana. Locally, what's the employee population here like now? You have 40, 50 people, or is it more spread out?
No, it's more than that, actually. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I would bet it's a little under 100, something like that. And it tends to be very highly skilled people. So, lots of PhDs in chemistry and chemical engineering. That's our bread and butter. Well, not necessarily just the PhD part, but chemical engineering and chemistry is our bread and butter. We tend to have finance and accounting people here, a little bit less so these days on the accounting side. They're a little bit more distributed, but tend to have people like that locally. Maybe that's not quite true on the finance side anymore either. That's more remote as well. A lot of our sort of centralized functions, HR, that kind of stuff, are in Sacramento. But the big ones are chemistry and chemical engineering. Our R&D labs and our pilot facilities are all here.
All right. Well, that's still a significant amount of the population in the company.
About half the company in terms of personnel is in Sacramento.
About half. So I'm saying this because we like to collect data on all the companies. So what's the payroll here like? You've got less than 100 people, so it's going to be in the millions. So
you can do your calculus. I won't confirm it.
yeah. I'm just using my own. So you've got to be about averaging with all the overheads and everything, probably more than 200,000 per person times 100 people. Yeah, you're getting up there. You're using a lot of the digits on the calculator.
Yeah, we're sort of in the we're not in the Uber scale or the gigantic scale local player range, but we're I don't know, we're probably like top 50, something like that, in terms of scale.
Yeah.
Sacramento region. That'd be my guess. I could be wrong about that. Maybe that's not. Maybe top 100.
I obviously been following the company for some time. It's a really remarkable story. And as you said at Geo, and then got awarded by the Business Journal, persistence and patience. I mean, did you have any thought that, it was going to take however long you've been in business now, over 20 years, to get there?
Yeah, well, so I don't think we've hit 20 years yet. I think we're at 16, but 16 is still a long time. I think we kind of had an inkling it was going to take a while. I read every history I can find on chemical companies. It just takes a while. It's just the way the technology in the industry works. It's big projects. It's complicated technology. There's science involved, not just engineering. Just takes a while.
Well, and that's a pretty common story.
Yeah.
At what point did you realize there wasn't much point in going to traditional venture capital to get what you needed?
Well, I mean, you could make an argument that we never figured that out. Every pitch feels like a low odds hit when you're raising capital early on, and so you've got to swing at all of them, right? Is sort of the way that it worked out, which includes venture capital. And I think it never quite felt right to think that a venture wasn't a good fit because there wasn't anything that felt like a good fit from a financing perspective. And so venture was as good as everything else for different reasons, right? And had different weaknesses in terms of its fit for us. I mean, the best was like family offices that can have a long time horizon, but there wasn't anything that was just obviously the right thing,
So the hunting process,
Yeah.
what was efficient there? Was it turning up at conferences? Was it friend of a friend and just, developing a network? How did you finally discover that Nestle and Pepsi were going to be interested in dealing with you?
Well, that was really we built networks pretty well. So, interestingly, in the pursuit of capital, we would often end up getting recommended to customers and strategics. And that was how we ended up in that space. Now, what's kind of interesting is that I think, ended up with some of the customers we did because they were more active in the circles that had capital raisers, right? Or capital there. So were they the best first customers? Not always, right? But they were the customers or the partners that were in the circles that we wandered around in. And so we ended up working with them. Now, they certainly weren't bad first customers, right? But you could imagine some of the other industries for, polyester or our technology more broadly being maybe a sort of an easier early fit, but we didn't find those. We found the big, average players, right? And so I think the serendipity there was kind of interesting. But the network building we did pretty well. We were pretty fast at that for what it's worth.
Well, I mean, there's no perfect answer on it, but did you get involved in any of the big competitions like CleanTech Open? Because sometimes that exposes you to a wide variety of
We did. I
network.
think we were like the second cleantech open, and I think we didn't win. They had different segments, and so we got I think with like water technology was where we ended up, and so we got engaged there. That was really helpful, but I think it was a bit of a rehash in some ways for us. We didn't know that was going to be the case, but it's a bit of a rehash for us of the Entrepreneurship Academy at Davis, Andy Hargadon. And that was that was like the thing that got us rolling, was Andy's Entrepreneurship Academy.
And it's sort of what we've modeled our current crash course around. It's a 16 session, 8-week program. The time that Andy started the Entrepreneurship Academy, you didn't see the business model canvas ideas out there quite as broadly as they are now. And he sort of folded that into
that book, the business model canvas book that Steve Blank and I can't remember the other guy's name.
Alex Osterwalder.
Yeah, Osterwalder. That was written after we started the company. I remember it was maybe 2010. I was actually talking to Steve Blank when he told me about it. I can't say that I know Steve well. I don't, but I ran into him a couple of times. And that was how I discovered the book was I was lucky enough to be chatting with him.
So just to wrap up, you got some good insights there, particularly hire the lawyers and the finance officer earlier than you might think necessary. Any other good insights that
I could spend, I find a lot of the advice is the generic stuff is hard to give, to make pithy. Spend quite a bit of time with younger entrepreneurs, or maybe entrepreneurs earlier in their journey is a better way to describe it. They're not always younger. And I think a lot of it is so specific to the business, especially in the world of hard technology, that it's hard to give these big, widely applicable ones. It's really, and maybe this is generic advice. People really have to think through what it is they're trying to accomplish and what the constraints around their particular business are in order to get to the right answers. And I think when we did that really well, we had a lot of success. And when we tried to do the sort of generically correct thing, we did ourselves a disservice often when we did that.
So really understanding your business, what you're trying to achieve, and make it sort of true to what's unique about your company. Well, that's a good one.
Well, there you go.
I really appreciate your time this morning. I'll let you get back and design some more plants.
Yeah, I don't get to do that personally that much anymore, but I'd like
to. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Gary. Good to talk to you as always.